I'd like to welcome everyone to Vladcast for this week. This week our topic is the divine services, the importance of the divine services. Many of you know this is one of my favorite topics, and especially if you've been a student in one of my classes, you know that we talk about this quite a bit in the pastoral school, the importance of the divine services. This time I'll refer to my script a little bit more just because I have some quotations that I want to read, and they're too big to put up on the screen, wouldn't look nice. So I'll ask you to bear with me in that regard. So here we go. Historically, the divine services have been the most important way that the faithful learn the truth that Christ brought to us when he was incarnate. How so? Well, we have to remember that for the vast majority of history, most Christians were illiterate. So they couldn't pick up a book at the kiosk and bring it home and read it. They couldn't even open up the Bible and read it. They couldn't read. And so the information that is given at the divine services, that was how most people learned. In fact, many generations upon generations of saints were sanctified in the church and learned about their faith so that they could practice it and become saints by the divine services. So this is really important, and I don't think that we can kind of overestimate that. Over generations and generations and generations, the divine services have been filtered. That is, all that was not true, all that was not correct was removed from the services. And so they're presented to us as a very beautiful package of the truth of the church. We learn about the lives of the saints, we learn about the life of Christ, we hear the scripture. All of this happens in the divine services, and if we're really honest, we probably quite undervalue those things in our days. And so I think the best way to think about the divine services is theology in action. That's theology in action. So I want to read to you something from Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeev. He's in charge of external relations for the Moscow Patriarchate. Very educated, very well read, and an excellent theological writer. Orthodox divine services are a priceless treasure that we must carefully guard. Similar services were once celebrated in other Christian communities, but over the centuries they were lost as a result of both liturgical and theological reforms, quote unquote. He puts reforms in quotes. Coming to church, however, we can't argue this, is a struggle. It's not easy. We don't live in a village where all of our houses sort of surround the church and we could just walk there, although I doubt that that would make any difference in our struggle. It would just, the automobile would not be part of the struggle, but nonetheless, we would still struggle to come to church, undoubtedly. But this is good. We need to struggle for the heavenly kingdom. As the Lord said in Matthew, from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent take it by force. Coming to church, coming to the divine services, is one of the best ways we exercise that violence, that force, by forcing ourselves to do what is good for our own salvation. But I don't want you to take my word for it, or even the erudite Metropolitan Hilarion's word for it. Let's listen to the saints of the church who were sanctified by these divine services. St. John of Kronstadt, the church and its divine services are an embodiment and realization of everything in Christianity. Here in words and actions are told the entire economy of our salvation. All of sacred and church history, all the goodness, wisdom, faithfulness, and immutability of God in his deeds and promises, his truth, holiness, and eternal might. Here we encounter a wonderful harmony in everything and an amazing logic, both in the whole and in the parts. It is the divine wisdom accessible to simple, loving hearts. Now, I read from St. John of Kronstadt first because I think that most people know that from the day that he was ordained a priest, he served the divine liturgy essentially every day, and on those days when he didn't serve, he partook of Holy Communion, right until the day of his death. So for all of those years, I don't recall now exactly how long he was a priest, but he lived to be pretty old, so probably 30, 40 years at least. He partook of Holy Communion every single day. He engaged in the divine services every day. And since we understand that salvation is transformation, transfiguration, theosis, certainly we see that St. John was transfigured by the divine services. which, since he was at the evening and morning services essentially every day, was the main way in which he exercised his faith. Let's listen to St. Theophan the Recluse now. All of our liturgical hymns are instructive, profound, and sublime. They contain the whole of our theology and moral teaching. Give us Christian consolation and instill in us a fear of the judgment. He who listens to them attentively has no need of other books on the faith. There's this understanding in the church that if we were able to attend all of the divine services every day, we would never have to open another book. We'd hear most of the gospel read in the church during the year, most of the epistle reading. So, in fact, almost the entire New Testament, outside of Revelation, because that's not generally read in the church, at least in the parish setting. And a lot of the Old Testament, a lot of the most important parts of the Old Testament. So I think that, and that's just the beginning. That's not even talking about the canons and the stichira and all of those things which are sung in the church and contain the theological truths of our faith. So I think that's very important. Obviously, we don't live in a situation, at least in our parish right now, where we could attend every service every day. Even if we had every service every day, it would be very hard for people. But nonetheless, the more often we can be in church at the divine services, the more we can learn and the more we can be transformed. One of the most important saints of the 20th century, which we know very little about, unfortunately, the new martyr Hilarion of Vire. He was a very important theological writer, and we can say, even though his life was separated from St. Cyprian of Carthage by about 18 centuries, he's his direct disciple. He wrote a very important piece called Pascha of Incorruption, which is available in English, and we will post that in the notes on YouTube with this video so that you can go right to that link and read it for yourself. He writes something I think very important. When you hear the chants in church, you become more and more convinced that they are truly rich in a treasure of ideas and are greatly important for a truly orthodox understanding of life today. Our dogmatic courses taught in the theological seminaries and academies are in this respect on an immeasurably lower level than the theology taught to the faithful by our readers and chanters from the cleros. That's a really powerful statement. Our dogmatics courses taught in the theological seminaries and academies are in this respect on an immeasurably lower level than that theology taught to the faithful by our readers and chanters from the church cleros. What an interesting statement, and how powerful and important that is for us. Here is this new martyr who gave up his life for Christ. Someone who lived, in the lifetimes of some of those people who are still alive. Most of them are gone now. But nonetheless, someone who's greatly venerated throughout the Russian Orthodox Church. This statement that we can learn more by being in church and listening to the divine services, by participating in the divine services, than we even could by taking a dogmatic theology course, that's something very powerful. And as a dogmatic theology instructor, I make my students read this and essentially memorize this every single year. But in case you think that this is only the old saints, the old-fashioned saints, those saints that lived a long time ago when they didn't have to do all these important things like watch Netflix and Disney Plus and, consume news media, 25 hours a day, 8 days a week. They didn't have to do any of that. Let's listen to somebody who, didn't quite live in the 24-hour news cycle, nonetheless is a contemporary saint, and that's St. John of Shanghai and San Francisco. The divine services in their composition contain all the fullness of the dogmatic teaching of the Church and set forth the path to salvation. They present invaluable spiritual wealth. The more fully and precisely they are fulfilled, the more benefit the participants receive from them. St. John of Shanghai and San Francisco also, like St. John of Kronstadt, partook of Holy Communion essentially every day from the time of his priestly ordination, and especially once he became a bishop. And undoubtedly this transformed him. Now, I think that the temptation is to sort of say, yes, St. John of Kronstadt, St. John of Shanghai and San Francisco, they partook of the magic every day, and therefore they were totally magical. The Church doesn't have magical teachings or thoughts or understandings. They were transformed. Yes, partaking of the holy mysteries is one of the main ways in which we're transformed. But even if for some reason we can't partake, to be able to be in church and to be in God's house, be in the synaxis, the gathering of the saints and all the angels. This also greatly transforms us and changes the way we live. And, well, I think that's exactly what we're striving for as Orthodox Christians. And those were long quotes, and now that I am looking at my notes, I chose almost all St. John's for this, and another one, St. John of the Ladder. This is a short one, and one that I think we could memorize and is very, very important. A sure sign of the deadening of the soul is the avoidance of church services. A sure sign of the deadening of the soul is the avoidance of church services. So this is good for us to know. It doesn't mean because one day you feel like not going to church that your soul is dead. No. But if you catch yourself in this pattern of like, well, I should go to church, but you know what? I haven't vacuumed the floor for 3 hours. I better do that again, and I'll miss church for that. You know, once we catch ourselves in that kind of crazy self-justification, we know that we need to really double down our efforts, really lean into our spiritual lives, and participate in the divine services for the good of our salvation. Now at St. Vladimir's, of course, we don't have the opportunity to serve every service every day. But we serve as often as we can, and thank God in the pandemic, we've been able to serve, except for 1 week, we've been able to serve the divine services, a cycle of the divine services, outside of Saturday and Sunday, once a week, at least, if not more. And for this, we're very thankful. I'm very thankful for all those who volunteer to sing and to read and to serve and to help. It's very, very helpful. In fact, it would be impossible to serve without them, because I can't serve the service by myself. There has to be at least one other person present in church. Sometimes that happens, but it's actually very rare, especially in the pandemic. It's been very rare. In fact, it hasn't happened that only one person has come, but that's happened in the past sometimes. We serve as often as we can, and we hope, God willing, to continue to serve more often. And with Archbishop Peter's blessing, our goal is, as we move from our present church into the new church, which will happen right after the school is complete and school is underway and tuition is being gathered, and we can hand off the church loan to the school loan to the school board, that we will serve the divine services in their fullness every day, evening and morning, at St. Vladimir Church. That's our goal. That's our goal, and we ask your help in that, in volunteering and supporting, and also your prayers that the Lord will strengthen us, because we need to have several priests in order to do that. It couldn't even be done very easily by 2 priests, but with God's help, we have a lot of hope that we'll be able to do that. Now, I think that we've talked about the importance of the divine services enough. It's, I think, pretty clear and obvious that they're important. The saints agree with that. Historically, the Christians obviously agree with that because they've attended the divine services. And I think that that's something that we want to make sure to really imbibe as a paradigm, that the divine services are incredibly important for us as Orthodox Christians. Now, let's learn a little bit more about them. There's 9 divine services appointed for each day of the year. So for each day, for each liturgical cycle, there's 9 different divine services. Those are Vespers, Compline, Midnight Office, Matins, the 1st hour, the 3rd hour, the 6th hour, the 9th hour, Divine Liturgy, or Typica. Now, some of these services we're very familiar with. Some of them, this may be the first time that you're hearing that such an animal exists as a midnight office. Compline and midnight office are mostly monastic services. We do have those in the parish church occasionally, mostly for very special feasts, like, for instance, the Nativity and the Theophany vigils both begin with Great Compline. And so that's where probably most of us feel that. Also, the first week of Great Lent, every evening, we serve Great Compline, which is Compline but just bigger, longer. The first week with the reading of the Canon of St. Andrew of Crete. So that's where we kind of have our exposure to that. But generally, Compline, Midnight Office are rarely served in parishes, and the 9th hour actually quite rarely also is served. The morning and evening services are not separate. I mean by that, obviously, they are separated by time, but they're one liturgical whole. We'll have a midnight Divine Liturgy coming up the week of Thanksgiving, actually on Thanksgiving Day itself, from Wednesday night into Thursday morning. And there we serve everything in one whole, right? We'll begin with vigil and just go right all the way through all of the services into the divine liturgy. But it's very rare that that happens. Usually there's an evening service and a morning service. But we need to struggle to see those as one whole, that the evening services and the morning services all go together. And I think this is a really, really important piece for us, because we, I think, tend to say, well, I'll go to liturgy, which is great, because liturgy is theologically the most important divine service. Unquestionably, hands down, no argument, definitely the case. But what's also very important is the educational aspect of the divine services. Divine liturgy being theologically most important, where the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ and we partake according to our Lord's command of his body and blood, that's super theologically important, unquestionably. But it doesn't really change much. Liturgy is pretty much the same. There's little changes, but it's essentially every day's liturgy is very much the same. Whereas the services in the evening, those change greatly. Those change greatly from day to day. Not necessarily the structure, but the content. The structure changes too based on the rank of the saint or the feast that we're celebrating. There's different ranks and they change the service slightly, but not greatly. But the content changes greatly. So every day of the week has different content depending, and that changes by the tone. So we have every day of the week, we have the 8 tones. That's already 56 different cuts of information that is presented to you. That's not even touching the actual saint of the day. So, on Thursday, on Thanksgiving Day, it's St. John Chrysostom. So then you pull in also all the information from St. John, and all of that educational information is conveyed to us at the divine services if we will only participate in them. So that's really important. We need to change our paradigm from the evening services are optional to the evening services are crucial. Because we kind of got that divine liturgy is crucial. That's the height, that's the crescendo, that's the place that we're going for that liturgical day is the divine liturgy. But you can't get to the top floor from the bottom. You got to get there somehow. There's got to be a ladder that helps you to get from the floor to the penthouse, so to speak. And that ladder is the rest of the divine services of the day. That's how we prepare ourselves for divine liturgy. That's how we learn about what's being celebrated that day, the saint or the feast of the day. And so one great way that we can help ourselves with our salvation is to strive to change our paradigm from evening services are optional to evening services are crucial. The Nativity Lent is coming soon, and I think it's good for us to think about in these Lenten periods how we can increase our spiritual struggle, right? Because Lenten periods are not just about abstaining from certain things culinarily. It's also about adding spiritual struggle to our lives. And what better way to add spiritual struggle, good, positive spiritual struggle to your life, than to attend more of the divine services? Let's think about this on a percentage basis, right? We've got to work, you've got to sleep, right? You have chores to do at home, you need to eat. All those things have to happen. But let's say that takes 95% of your time. That's probably an exaggeration, but let's say that the necessary things of our life, the things that we absolutely have to do, take 95% of our time. That leaves us 5% left for God. Obviously, we understand that we would be shooting for 10% ideally, but let's just argue 5% because that's the math I did. Honestly, I didn't do the 10%. So let's look at that. So if we give 5% of our time every week to the divine services, that's about 6.5 hours per week. That's something, but it's not craziness. So let's say we go to Saturday Vigil. That's about 2.5 hours. Sunday Divine Liturgy, that's 2 hours. That leaves us 2.5 hours left. Actually leaves us 2 hours left. So that would be about one weekday evening service or weekday morning divine liturgy. It takes about 2 hours. Actually, it's not probably quite that long for liturgy, and maybe it's a little longer for evening service. But basically, if you give 5% of your time to God to attend the divine services, then assuming that everybody goes Saturday and Sunday, which is the standard that we should be striving for, that gives us a couple of hours that we could also dedicate to either attending divine liturgy some weekday or the evening services some afternoon and evening, based on our work schedule, right? Because some people work in the afternoon, some work in the morning. That's understood. We're not asking people to stop working or stop taking care of the things that are necessary in their life, but what's most necessary in our life is the striving for salvation. And if we put that first, then hopefully we'll be able to dedicate that 5% to the divine services for our own good. We're coming to the end now, and I'd like to read you one more quote from Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev, because I think it's really good. And I think it's very helpful. And again, this is another one of those things that I make my students memorize. If there are differences in the understanding of a dogma between a certain theological authority and liturgical texts, I would be inclined to give preference to the liturgical texts. And if a textbook of dogmatic theology contains views different from those found in liturgical texts, it is the textbook and not the liturgical texts that need correction. You see, the way the church works is that the Holy Spirit guides the church. It's alive. It lives. Saints are generated by the church. God does not leave his creation. He didn't just start the world spinning like a basketball and walk away to do other stuff. God is engaged in our lives, and God guides the Holy Church, and especially in the divine services. And so, as I mentioned earlier, those things which are not right, which could make their way into the services, those are filtered out, because the church filters the divine services and makes sure that this is the highest expression of theological truth. And so what Metropolitan Hilarion says is, if you got a textbook of dogmatic theology and you've got a divine service and they don't disagree, it's the textbook that needs to be repaired, not the divine service. As a parish, we do pretty well attending the divine services. I mean, I'm very thankful that, as I said, people volunteer to come and to read and to sing and to serve in the altar and to help and participate, and people are there praying. It's great. I'm very thankful that we have the opportunity to have a robust liturgical life. It's very helpful for me and my salvation, and I think it's very helpful for the parishioners. At the same time, each of us should examine ourselves, especially as we enter into the Nativity Lent, and really think about whether we could increase our participation in the services as our Lenten extra struggle. I think we have to pray about this. We have to ask the Lord to grant us zeal. We have to ask the Lord to grant us zeal to invest in our salvation, to attend more of the services. And I hope that for all of us as a parish family, we can begin that during this upcoming Nativity Lent. May the Lord grant you that zeal and strength to participate more often in the spring of salvation, the theology in action, which is the divine services.